Hi guys, it's Zach, and I'm joined here today with Dan.
What's up?
And this is our trailer deconstruction of the Dark Souls 3 gameplay reveal trailer that was shown at Gamescom this year.
The first thing to mention here is that this is most likely not the final Dark Souls game, as we previously said in a different video. There may be more installments in this series.
Now, moving on the trailer a bit, the first thing we see is the Dark Sign. Now, this is something that has featured in both Dark Souls 1 and Dark Souls 2, and it plays a pretty important theme in the series.
And now going back to the trailer, we hear some dialogue from the narrator who has been used in both the previous games in this series.
Yes, indeed. As they say on pilgrimage, the fire fades, and the lords have no thrones.
Now just in case you didn't hear that, it sounds like she says, as they say, a pilgrimage, the fire fades, and the lords have made claims.
Now, this is a very interesting piece of dialogue. In Dark Souls 2, the Lord Souls were reclaimed. For example, Nito the Grave Lord's soul was reclaimed by the Rotten, so therefore this dialogue could be hinting that the same thing is going to happen, that potentially 4 new characters have reclaimed the Lord Souls.
Yeah, I definitely think it's suggesting that it's going to follow a similar path where the player has got to go around collecting these really powerful souls against some really difficult bosses.
Rewinding a bit back to 36 seconds, we see a castle here, and it's very reminiscent of Anor Londo from the first Dark Souls game.
Yeah, this really reminds me of both the previous games in the series. With the classic Gothic architecture, it does look very similar.
Yeah, and you've got the really beautiful lighting and the sunset, which once again is very similar to the first Dark Souls game and the way that Anor Londo looked.
Now what we can see here is a dragon which appears to be dead. Now if you look closely just above the dragon, it appears that the skin is flaking off.
Now this is just speculation, but we also see a dragon at the end of the trailer breathing fire, so it would lead one to believe that this dragon's just been killed, and perhaps this is what happens when you kill bosses. Perhaps they you absorb the soul, similar to the way you see it in Skyrim, in the sense that the kind of dragon disintegrates. Maybe there's going to be an animation for collecting a soul, which will be very interesting. There'd be a nice change, as opposed to just exploding. A bit later on, we see a group of hollows, and they appear to be worshipping something, and it's kind of ambiguous as to what they're worshipping.
Yeah, I've really got no idea. The only thing I can think, maybe if you look just behind the tree, it appears to be some sort of statue, so potentially they could be worshipping that, trying to get as close as possible. So continuing onwards now, we see a brand new enemy that we haven't seen so far in the Dark Souls series. Now when looking at this enemy, it appears to be some sort of guard who's patrolling, something like that. But what's important to look at is the weapon that he's holding. It's clearly some kind of brand. But what I think is important is the symbol that's etched onto the end of the brand, which is the peace symbol, which is quite contrasting because obviously weapons aren't designed to inflict pain, when peace is the complete opposite of that.
Exactly, it's a very interesting contrast. And if we continue, just a matter of seconds, we see this really weird, creepy monster in what looks like to be a prison cell. Now this monster, it has like a human face and it looks like it's got like an insect kind of body or something weird like that. But what could be speculated is that this is actually set in a prison here, and the enemy with the brand is actually some kind of prison guard, going around with a lantern, and in the cell, which is obviously open now, we see a monster. So, it's just speculation as to the setting, but it definitely looks like it has a lot of atmosphere. The next scene we see is a pilgrimage of hollows.
Now we're not exactly sure what they're doing here, but if you move the video forward just a little bit, you can actually see what appears to be the first shot of our player.
It's pretty ambiguous as to what is happening here, but we could be led to believe that perhaps this pilgrimage, the hollows are in fact following the player. The reason we say this is because the pilgrimage seems to be happening in what appears to be like a church-style setting, and when you continue forwards and see the shot of the player, that is also some kind of altar which appears to be set in like a cathedral.
And then if you go back to a point we made earlier, this relates again to the worshipping hollows.
And also, another quite a big thing to consider as well is that the narrator, she actually says that the first thing she says is a pilgrimage. And so it seems like there's going to be a theme of pilgrimage going through this game, like the other games, but more so with this one.
Continuing on again now, and we get another view who we think is the character again. And the reason we think this is the character is because he's wearing the elite knight armour that we're familiar with from the previous games. Now what we see him doing is essentially stabbing some kind of sword-like thing into a dead body. Now that sword looks very similar to the bonfire poles that were used in the first 2 games.
Now, what's really interesting about this could possibly be like the origin of bonfires, how they're actually made, because in the previous Dark Souls games, if you actually look at a bonfire, you can see a small pile of bones with the bonfire pole stabbing into them like a sword. And so this is potentially how bonfires are made. And so this is really making an interesting point. There's a rumour that players can apparently make their own bonfires where they choose to.
Yeah, and this leads to loads of interesting questions about how that's going to affect the gameplay.
Yeah.
Is it going to make the game too easy if you can essentially save a checkpoint whenever you want to?
Exactly. It could possibly integrate the invasion system, so essentially making a bonfire would make you gain sin, and therefore you're more likely to get invaded by a player. And, another thing to consider as well is that, are you able to fast travel to the bonfires that you make? Are they permanent? Are they temporary? There's a lot of interesting questions surrounding this, making your own bonfires, but it's something we haven't seen before, and it's a very interesting mechanic that they've added to the game. At this point, the trailer switched gameplay, and we see the player battling 2 skeleton-like enemies. Now, a nice Easter egg is that one of the enemies actually does an Artorias somersault. Now, Artorias was a boss, one of the DLC bosses in the original Dark Souls game, and he was kind of famous for doing this big somersault attack.
Now you may notice that the enemy is fine, has his guard up, or he looks like he does at least, and then the player uses a really heavy attack and literally just breaks straight through it. The shield has no effect.
Definitely. One thing that has been rumoured is that the game will feature a new system called Weapon Arts, and what this allows players to do is customise the way that they use each individual weapon. Next we see a very scary shot of a big skeleton figure looming over the player holding a torch. Now, we have no idea what this character is and whether it's a boss or an NPC or what it is.
Now you may have just missed that there, but if you just rewind it a little bit, you can actually see that the player appears to use what looks like a miracle.
I did not notice that actually. I would assume that pyromancy miracles are returning, but this is the first thing we've seen
To prove. Definitely.
Absolutely. This next section of the gameplay trailer shows the character using a bow and arrow, and we can clearly see that the weapon arts are affecting the way that he uses it, because he's rolling around and firing arrows much, much quicker than we've ever seen before. And another thing to note as well is that his arrows are glowing, both in the quiver and the ones that are stabbed into the enemy.
One thing I really like here is what you mentioned before about how he's using the bow and arrow in a different way to what we've seen before. It seems much more fluid than before, the way he dive rolls, which I really like.
Once again here we see a player being affected by a weapon art, and we can see him do a very, very fast-paced spinning attack. And so this is really just showing the broad variety of ways that you can use your weapon.
One thing to note here is the absolute colossal size of what appears to be a boss in this game. Now this is really reminiscent of the Demon Souls games, where there was much larger bosses.
In this last section of the gameplay trailer, we see some of the game's bosses. They look much more fast-paced and brutal, so there may be some inspiration taken from Bloodborne in this game.
And now you may notice at 2 points throughout this section, there's a letterbox effect applied onto the screen. Now what that suggests is that the cinematic effects that we see in the previous 2 games at the start of each boss fight is returning.
They really add to the tension of the game before the big dramatic boss fight. The next boss we see that appears to clamber out of a portal has been named the Dancer of the Frigid Valley. Now, not much is known about this boss, but one thing can be noted is how aesthetically brilliant this boss looks. The way that it's got an ethereal cloak floating around and the shining armour and the way it skulks around the room. It proceeds to kill the player in a really brutal way, so it looks like the brutal fatalities of Dark Souls are returning.
Yeah, I think the only thing that's missing right now is the words "You died" appearing in big letters on the screen.
Yeah, just to rub it in.
The trailer ends with the player meeting his demise through the fiery breath of a dragon.
And there we have it, Dark Souls 3, a game by From Software due to be released early 2016.
That's the end of our trailer deconstruction. If you made it this far, thank you very much for watching our video. If you enjoyed it, please give it a like and of course hit the subscribe button. And please, if you get a chance to comment, we'd really like to know what you think about this video.
Dark Souls is a game that has so much speculation and symbolism, so it'd be really great to see what you got from the trailer. Thanks very much, guys.